So, please tell me that you can hear me and see me. My last seminar, technically, YouTube Live pooped out on me after 40 minutes, which would be a real problem with this one, because in my prior seminar, 35 minutes is usually how long I talk, and then I take 15 minutes of questions. And I was like, okay, you guys can email me, and ladies can email me after this if you have any questions, since our 15 minutes was taken away. So I'm going to say this probably 3 or 4 times before I actually start this seminar. But this one, man, I'm rushing to get it done in 45 minutes. There's a lot to say on why TSR failed. So I just wanted to tell you all right now, if that happens here, if it totally poops out on me, I will start a Facebook live stream to finish it. I just tested it out. Facebook live streams are apparently very, very easy to start. So if in the middle of this I send a message saying I'm moving to Facebook Live, my name is Benjamin Riggs on Facebook. I am in Milwaukee. I will post a link on the Gen Con message board to the Facebook Live feed in case this poops out on us most of the way through. Because when it pooped out on me in my prior seminar, it took like 10 minutes to get everything up and running again, and I'm like, well, there's no point in even starting taking questions. I'm just going to move on to my next seminar. That said, if some of you were in my prior seminar and want to ask me questions now, I will gladly respond. But this is the first time I've used YouTube live streaming, and so far, not a huge fan, because really, getting the entirety of the seminar to you wonderful people is what I needed from YouTube live stream, and the fact that it pooped out 35 minutes in is really discouraging and upsetting. Like, I don't mind if it's laggy, I don't mind if the picture's not great, it's not like I'm going to be holding up amazing artifacts from ye olden days of TSR, but I really need it to keep going and not poop out, which is exactly what it did. So like I said, I just tested out YouTube Live. If everything goes to heck in a handbasket on this, again, I will post I just tried out Facebook Live. I will post a Facebook Live link on the Gen Con page if there is a problem, and I apologize in advance if there is. All right. So, Squeaker Kev says, Ben, I heard a rumor that if you say Lorraine Williams' name 5 times in a mirror, she will appear behind you. Is that true? If it were true, I would have interviewed her by now. I have really tried hard to get a hold of Lorraine Williams or Will Martins. Will Martins was the COO of TSR. And really, the most problematic and disastrous decisions made at TSR were made by the two of them in some capacity or another. Either, one of them or the other. I have an awful lot of documentation with their signatures on them that's very troubling. But I have not interviewed either of them. And Lorraine, I have contacted through many different channels. Will Martins, I've been calling him on the phone. But I think the real truth is neither one of them wants to talk to me because for them, I would assume TSR is a story of failure. For a lot of other people, it's a story of, I watched these other people make disastrous decisions, and I was smart, and they passed the buck up to Lorraine Williams and or Will Martins. It would be absolutely fascinating to get to interview them. And again, I think it's much more complicated. Like, you will hear me talk about how Lorraine Williams is often portrayed as some sort of beast or monster, but that's just not the way it is. All right, I'm going to check my live stream one more time, and then I'm going to get started. So give me 1 second. Oh, God. Hi, Peter. No pressure or anything. Mr. Adkison, who owns Gen Con, is on my live stream. I'll say this, Peter. At least You had the decency to let me know you're here. Ryan Dancy last year ambushed me. He just came and sat in my seminars for 2 hours, and then afterwards comes up to me and he says, hey, nice to see you. For those of you who don't know who Ryan Dancy is, he was the brand manager for D&D for a while at Wizards of the Coast, and he also was involved in the negotiation of the deal to buy TSR. Have I read Dilli's book? I have not read Flint Dilli's book yet, just because it just recently came out, but I've interviewed him extensively. So with that, I'm going to throw out some warnings first. First of all, this is my second hour of attempting to correctly use YouTube live stream, and in my first seminar, I got 35 minutes in before YouTube Live pooped out on me. And it took me 10 minutes to get everything up and running again, which would be really problematic for this seminar. For my first seminar, it was fine because I just got to the Q&A session and then it pooped out. If in 30 or 40 minutes YouTube live stream poops out on us, I'm going to switch over to Facebook Live. I checked it out very quickly. It looks like it'll work just fine. I will post a link to Facebook Live in the Gen Con messaging section of this event. So again, if there's a problem, just go to the Gen Con website, go to this event's page, click on messages, and there will be a link to to Facebook Live there, so that we can finish this seminar up. Because in my prior seminar, like I said, I talked for about 35 minutes. This one, I'm pushing 50. So with that, I am going to start talking. I do want to warn you, if you are really sensitive to discussion of matters of sexual abuse, there is a brief mention of sexual abuse in this seminar, not detailed or anything, but I do like to throw it out there. It sounds really ominous. It's not, but I do like to warn people. So let me get going. So I'm Ben Riggs. I'm a teacher, writer, and podcaster. I've written for Geek and Sundry. You can find more of my madness on the Plot Points podcast. I have a book on role-playing game adventure design called Encounter Theory. It's up for an Any tomorrow, and it is currently on sale on DriveThruRPG. It's on sale for the next week for Gen Con. But for the last 3 years, I've been writing a book on the sale of TSR to Wizards of the Coast. Right now, we're looking for it. My agent is Susan Velasquez at the Jabberwocky Literary Agency. If you're a publisher, and this sounds interesting to you, Susan Velasquez at Jabberwocky would love to talk to you. And now, I need to remind you to turn in your ticket. You do that electronically, again, on the Gen Con page for this event. I believe it's in the upper right-hand corner. My interface looks a little bit different than yours, but if you go to the page, there's an electronic turn-in button. Please turn it in so that Peter Adkison knows that you were here. So, I would like to begin by considering two events beside each other. The first is a memo that was released by TSR on December 19th, 1995, and it goes like this. TSR Incorporated, the producers of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons games, announces yet another year of tremendous sales. Quote, TSR's financial outlook is extremely positive, unquote, said Willard Martins, the company's chief operating officer. Quote, our role-playing game revenue increased 20% in 1995, as it has annually for the last 6 years, end quote. The company's disclosure comes as its fiscal year is about to end, and in response to a recent inaccurate comment made on the internet by Wizards of the Coast's president, Peter Adkison. In response to a question about the role-playing game industry, Adkison said the industry's and TSR's role-playing game sales have been on a steady decline. Quote, it is unfortunate that Mr. Adkison painted with such a broad brush. His statement in regard to TSR is completely inaccurate, unquote, said Lorraine Williams, TSR president and CEO. She added, quote, we wish Wizards of the Coast well, as they divest role-playing and other products from their company. However, their inability to produce successful role-playing game lines does not necessarily reflect the state of the industry, and certainly not TSR. Consumers are going to see some extremely exciting changes in our products and marketing in 1996, said Williams. Now, we have to flash forward in time from December 19th, 1995 to a year and a day later, December 20th, 1996. That day, TSR fired dozens of employees. Flash forward another 6 months to June 1997, and Peter Adkison, who was mocked by TSR in that 1995 press release, is being handed the keys to TSR in the driveway of the company by Lorraine Williams. So, how did all this come about? How did the most powerful and original game company fall so low? I've been researching this question for the past 3 years, and I have come up with some fascinating answers. I do want to say that talking to you, I'm looking ahead. If you send me any notes, it is on the right. And Peter, that, just so you know, that memo was sent by Jim Butler. Do I have the last name, or is that the guy who writes the Dresden novels? Anyway, it was released by, I believe, Jim Butler at TSR, and it was released on Usenet, and I found it in an old Usenet archive. Mr. Butler confirmed that he actually sent it out, but it was essentially, he said, dictated to him by Lorraine Williams. So, if you have any problems, it might take me a minute to notice because I have to look over here on the right to see that there's any issues. And I do want to say again, if there are any issues, we will move to Facebook Live, and I will send you a link to that on the Gen Con page for this event. Moving forward. Okay. The short answer to how Wizards of the Coast, how TSR went from writing snide memos, kind of poking fun at Peter Adkison, to being purchased by Peter Adkison and Wizards of the Coast in about 18 months. The answer to that question is essentially mismanagement. But the details of that mismanagement are both instructive and interesting. So first of all, TSR really operated under unrealistic sales expectations. In the early 1990s, TSR products were doing really well. Not as well as they were doing in the early 1980s, but really well. The assumptions were that TSR products would continue to do very, very well, and that assumption was proved wrong. But again, in the early 1990s, you had second edition coming out. Those books sold well. Novel sales were absolutely huge. For example, Night of the Black Rose by Jim Lauder sold 175,000 copies. He outsold Stephen King some weeks at Walden Books. And those sales numbers were just going to prove to be unsustainable over time. There was also a Random House agreement that would prove instrumental and destructive to TSR. Random House was TSR's distributor to the book trade. They sold to Walden Books, B. Dalton's. They would be the avenue to access Barnes & Noble today. And the agreement that TSR had with Random House was both unusual and eventually disastrous. And here's the deal. So TSR received money from their distributor, Random House, not when product was sold by Random House, but when product was shipped to Random House. Now, it could be returned plus a restocking fee, but in those heady days of amazing sales, that rarely happened. So because of this agreement, TSR became a when and how much can we ship company, not a how it's selling company. Now, at the same time, Random House is TSR's avenue to get into malls and bookstores. At the same time, they obviously had the hobby trade, game stores. There was, again, on that side of the company, an unusual and eventually disastrous sales situation. TSR used a financial transaction called factoring. In January, TSR would pre-sell all their products for the year to a bank. And in January, they would receive 82% of what they would eventually receive later on. Now, the advantage here is that TSR is receiving all their money for all their sales in January, allowing them to play and pay people. Now, the downside is that after January, TSR could never change their product release schedule. Now, this is also going to prove disastrous as the 90s go on. Furthermore, TSR got in the habit of not paying their printer. I hope I'm pronouncing this right, but I believe the printer's name was Keenahan in Beaver Dam, Wisconsin. It got so bad that TSR eventually gave their office building to the printer and signed an exclusivity agreement with them saying that they would never print with anyone else. All of these problems are compounded at TSR by ego. Management was told by employees that book management didn't believe it. Management went and picked a fight with DC Comics. One TSR executive was quoted saying of DC Comics, uh-oh. Uh-oh, maybe we're back. Maybe I don't need to go to Facebook Live. Maybe I don't need to go to Facebook Live. Tell me. I think I'm okay. Give me lag. Stopped at DC Comics. I'm frozen. Somebody's keeping themselves awake for this. Come on. I think we might be okay. Can you see me? Can you see me? Give me a thumbs up if you can see me. I'm back. Okay, I'm back. All right. I'm going to give it a chance. But I'm not going to mess around with this again. If it goes down one more time, I'm going to Facebook Live. I have four more hours of events scheduled on Saturday, and I think I'm going to try that out. So, I'm told that the last thing that you heard me say was management picked a fight with DC Comics. So, okay. Let me go back to that. So, management picked a fight with DC Comics. One executive even said of DC Comics, quote, "We will bury them," unquote. TSR of Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, was going to bury DC Comics, a division of Time Warner Communications. All this leads to a loss of talent. You lose New York Times best-selling authors like Bob Salvatore, Margaret Weiss, Tracy Hickman. There's a brain drain in role-playing games in the 1990s. You lose Zeb Cook and Bruce Nesmith to the video game industry. Jeff Grubb goes down to a part-time freelancer. I'm going to look over here and just make sure everything is okay. I'm seeing a bunch of thumbs up. And okay, I'm going to keep talking. But again, if this happens one more time, I'm just going to move to Facebook Live. All right. So all of this leads to cash flow problems, supply problems, and distribution problems, which puts TSR in a position to be bought by Wizards of the Coast in 1997. In case you know nothing about TSR, here is a history of the company in just 5 minutes. Now, TSR existed to publish D&D, and D&D was a creation of Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson. D&D is truly a fusion of their vision, and in my opinion, Dave Arneson does not and never has received his due as co-creator of the game. In the early 1970s, Gary Gygax was an insurance underwriter and huge nerd. He founded not one but two gaming organizations, the International Federation of Gamers and the Castle and Crusade Society. He also founded Gen Con, which is today owned by Peter Adkison. Ha ha ha. In 1971, Gary Gygax writes Chainmail, a medieval minis game with Jeff Perrin. The game, quote, made a number of innovations to the game table. It provided rules for man-to-man combat, and a 14-page supplement for fantasy that included rules for using elves, dwarves, trolls, and dragons could be found at the end of the book, end quote. Now, Twin Cities native Dave Arneson meets Gary Gygax at Gen Con 2, He takes chainmail and begins using the man-to-man combat system, but players controlled only one piece on the board, an idea he got from another board game called Brownstein. Adventures took place in a fantasy world of Arneson's own creation, Blackmoor, where characters explored trap-filled rooms of monsters where they received treasure. Lastly, characters persisted from session to session in Arneson's Blackmoor games. In November of 1972, Arneson made a pilgrimage down to Lake Geneva to run Blackmoor for Gary Gygax and his friends. Ending in the wee hours of the morning, the game could be called the first session of Dungeons & Dragons ever played. Gygax was vastly impressed by what Arneson had done with chainmail and immediately asked for a set of his Blackmoor rules. 18 cribbed and cramped handwritten pages soon followed, which Gygax set about typing, expanding, and revising. Soon, Gygax had 50 pages of rules, which he began playtesting with his children, Elise and Ernie. Writing 40 years after the fact, Gygax said he first called this project the Fantasy Game. Realizing the title was as bland as skim milk, Gygax polled his players and family for a title and came up with Dungeons & Dragons. TSR formed because no other company would publish the game. In 1974, TSR published the first edition of D&D. It cost $10 and was considered so pricey at the time that people went around photocopying the rules. Now, sales of D&D shoot up. It becomes a cultural phenomenon in the early 1980s. Advanced Dungeons & Dragons is created. There are lawsuits about whether or not Dave Arneson gets royalties for that. The Satanic Panic begins. There's a TV show. There are toys, books, novels. And then profits are down, and in 1985, Gary Gygax is replaced. He loses control of the company to Lorraine Williams. Lorraine Williams is one of the inheritors of the... Oh, we're getting glitchy. A little pause there. I'll give it 1 second. Uh-oh. Still going. We good. Okay. I'm going to keep talking. I'm just going to move back a little bit in case people miss some things. Yeah, as long as there's good audio and poor video, we can live. Because, like I said, I'm not going to show you any artifacts from TSR history. As long as you can hear my voice, you're good. All right. Lorraine Williams. Now, Lorraine Williams was one of the inheritors of the Dilli family fortune, which is Buck Rogers' money. Now, she does literally save the company in 1985. People described Lorraine Williams as the adult in the room who could keep the money flowing into TSR. She could talk to banks. Now, she really does save the company in 1985, but we also have to lay the failure of the company in 1997 at her feet. She really is portrayed poorly and kind of like a villain in most of the accounts you'll read, which is really, inaccurate. Here's where I need to mention my trigger warning. So, William W. Connors was a writer at TSR, a game designer and a writer. He moved his wife and young family to Lake Geneva to work at TSR, and while doing so, his wife had essentially a breakdown. She started having these memories of tragic sexual abuse from when she was a child. And it gets so bad that... Let me check myself. Okay, we're looking good still. It gets so bad that Bill Connors has to have his wife hospitalized. He was afraid that she was going to hurt herself. And she's hospitalized for a year. He spends that year, still working at TSR and taking care of his two young sons. He described coming home at night, and he would have one son sit on this shoulder, another son sit on this shoulder, and they'd play Tomb Raider, and the kids would tell him what to make Lara Croft do as they're playing Tomb Raider. After a year, his wife is going to get out of the hospital, but she needs 24-hour care. And Bill Connors is like, well, I cannot work at TSR and provide my wife with 24-hour care, so clearly I need to quit TSR. So he goes in to quit. He actually does quit, and he's going and cleaning out his desk when he is told that Lorraine Williams will not accept his resignation, that he can do whatever he needs to do to make it work. He can take as much vacation time as he needs. The company will continue to pay him, but he's such an important part of the company that he will not be allowed to quit. And Bill Connors to this day will sing glorious hallelujahs to Lorraine Williams. And I always like telling that story because, we're going to describe a lot of bad business decisions that Lorraine Williams makes, but that doesn't make her a bad person. Again, Bill Connors said if it wasn't for her, his family might not have stayed together, and he certainly wouldn't have stayed in game design. All right. I am going to, every time I look over there, I just check the feed, and it looks like we're good. So, we need to talk about that Random House agreement, because it seems to be a foundational reason that TSR was in a position to be bought by Wizards of the Coast. Here's how publishing worked in the early 1990s. In the publishing industry, publishers made books. They sold these books to distributors, and the distributors would then sell them to Walden Books, B. Dalton's, and other retailers. Now, publishers were paid when the product was sold by the distributor to the retailer, which makes sense. Once the product left the distributor's shelves, the publisher got a check. Money received by the publisher was based on the demand for the product, as Econ 101 tells us is right and healthy. This is not the situation that TSR finds itself in. Jim Falone, who was director of sales and marketing at TSR, said, quote, TSR was paid for the gross product shipped to Random House within 30 days, whether it's sold or not. In other words, TSR could print 100,000 books, ship them to Random House, and receive payment even if those books were not sold. Now, that's an arrangement which can seem like it defies capitalism and common sense, but one of the things that Jim Falone was very eloquent about was talking about how, given the cost to TSR of publishing things like hardcover books with color art on the inside, when TSR products were selling, it actually made a lot of sense because it allowed TSR to both reprint old products that were selling and print new products that there were demand for. But what's going to happen is when sales drop off, the company moves from, again, printing products that are selling to printing products and simply shipping them, because printing products is habitually going to become the printing of money for TSR. Soon in the 90s, TSR employees are referring to this as, quote, El Banco de Random House, unquote. Falone said, quote, if we needed extra cash flow, we could overship Random House, unquote, because they were paid for the number of products shipped, not for the eventual sales of the product. TSR acted as though it had broken free from the cycle of supply and demand. Now, yes, Random House could return unsold books for a refund and charge a restocking fee, but Jim Falone said, quote, when you're chasing sales and momentum is strong, there are little in the way of returns, unquote. The ability to trade product for cash led to a number of poor decisions on the part of TSR management, which acted as though the fundamentals of economics no longer applied to them. It led to a massive overprinting in an effort to use the Bank of Random House as a store of ready cash. This overprinting would take a number of successful games and drive them into the red. For example, Dragon Strike. Dragon Strike was a 1993 product for beginners which came with a videotape explaining how to play a role-playing game. It sold well, with sales of 100,000 copies and orders for another 50,000 more. TSR management, however, specifically Lorraine Williams, I am told, decided to print not 50,000 more copies of Dragon Strike, but rather 150,000 more copies of the game. Dale Donovan, who was on the editorial staff of TSR's Dragon magazine at the time, said, quote, the rest sat in the warehouse until TSR forced them down the supply channel, souring it for the sequel, unquote. When he saw the vast mountain of Dragon Strike, which was supposed to be sent to distributors, Jim Falone couldn't believe it. Quote, I think the first sign of a crack was when I was asked to double ship Random House a very large amount of Dragon Strike games. I stopped the shipment thinking it was a mistake, unquote. A week later, Fallone's boss, Vice President of Marketing Rick Bailing, discovered the games hadn't shipped. He came to see Jim Fallone. Fallone remembered, quote, Rick Bailing stormed into my office while I was on the phone with my counterpart at Random House and screamed at me at the top of his lungs and stormed out. After a second, my buddy from Random House said, "Did you just get fired?" All I could say was, I wasn't sure. I showed up the next day and nothing was said of it again, but the product got shipped before the close of the quarter, unquote. And again, the point of shipping that product was that within 30 days, TSR would receive a check for that product from Random House. TSR got paid when they got shipped, not when the product sold. Dragon Dice, a collectible card game, was released in collectible dice game was released in 1995. It was a similarly successful product driven into the red by massive overproduction. Donovan said of these overprinting blunders, quote, TSR managed to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory again and again. Jeff Grubb, a genius D&D designer, said that the company shipped copies of Dragon Dice in via air freight because they wanted to make sure they had enough copies for Gen Con. But sending game via plane was obviously vastly more expensive than shipping it by boat. Now we have to discuss what's going on in the hobby trade, TSR's sales to game stores across the nation. John Danovich was director of sales and marketing at TSR in the 1990s, and he described TSR's sales process to hobby stores this way. TSR would plan out its releases for the year. For example, May 1995 would see the release of a revised second edition Player's Handbook. In June 1995, TSR would release the History of Dragonlance. In July 1995, TSR would release the Birthright box set and Van Richten's Guide to the Vistani. In January, sales would take this product schedule and use it to generate pre-orders. Danovich said, quote, all of the sales that were done through the hobby trade were predicated on a pre-order system that was triggered in January. We tried to get every unit we could sold in January. All the new release, all the pre-release, any back sales, it was all predicated off of January sales, unquote. To encourage distributors and game stores to commit to making purchases on products which they had not yet seen, TSR sold these products in January at a discounted rate. Perhaps the sweetest part of the deal, from the buyer's point of view, was they didn't actually have to pay for these products until the product was published and shipped to them. And they got a discounted price just for signing a contract, agreeing to make the purchase at the later date. So just to summarize again. So it's January. TSR tries to sell everything via pre-order in January to hobby stores. But the hobby stores don't actually pay TSR in January. They simply sign a contract agreeing that they will pay, but they're paying at a discounted rate because they're pre-ordering. So TSR now has this stack of contracts from distributors and game stores agreeing that they will buy these products from TSR at this set rate. TSR then takes those products. TSR then takes those contracts and sells them to an investment bank. Now, from the bank's point of view, purchasing these contracts is a solid investment. TSR has an exceptional history of hitting deadlines for products. The buyers had already signed contracts agreeing to the price for the products. Now, the bank, of course, wants a percentage. Danovich said that after the discount to the distributors and the bank's cut, TSR was left with, quote, 82% of what you would have gotten if you sold it later on, unquote. When the promised product was created and shipped, the distribution companies would then pay the agreed upon price to the investment bank, not TSR. Now, why would TSR go through all this bother just to lose 18% of money on every sale? Because, Janovich said, you get it all in January. This is called factoring. Now, TSR benefited from the arrangement because it allowed the company to receive large sums of cash early in the year, allowing it to budget for costs and expenses with certainty about money on hand. There were two significant downsides on factoring. I'm just going to look over there, make sure everything's okay. And looks like we're good. Okay, people are listening, it's flowing. Okay, good. Factoring. There were two significant downsides in factoring for TSR. First, there is the 18% it lost on every sale it made through factoring. Second, it means that TSR is going to lose flexibility. The company could not respond with any degree of fleetness to changes in the market because of the commitments it had made to the investment banks and its distributors in the beginning of the year. Over the long term, factoring would have an insidious effect on the financial health of TSR. One example of this involves the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons CD-ROM core rules and Babbages. If you are not a Gen Xer and you don't know what Babbages is, Babbages was the computer store in every mall in America in the 1990s. And in the early 1990s, everyone knew computers were going to totally change the world. But nobody knew exactly how. TSR decided to devote money to creating a CD-ROM version of the AD&D 2nd Edition rules. This CD-ROM version of the rules had hyperlinks. It had a character generator. Now, nothing quite like it had ever been done in the RPG industry before, which made it hard to sell. After much effort on John Danovich's part, Babbages committed to ordering approximately 30,000 units of the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons CD-ROM core rules. In January, Babbages signs contracts agreeing to this, and TSR sells the contract to an investment bank. Then Babbages goes bankrupt. John Danovich knew what would happen if those tens of thousands of copies of the AD&D CD-ROMs shipped to Babbages. They would immediately be sold at a major discount. That would destroy the market for the entire product field of digital D&D rules because thousands of people who wanted to buy the rules could go and buy them from Babbages for cheap instead of picking them up at their local game store or another retail outlet. As a result, sales of the product would be poor at these other locations, souring them on buying anything else, any other future digital products from TSR. Danovich set up a meeting with Lorraine Williams where he told her, quote, "We can't send this product out," end quote. He said it would be sold at a discount and ruin that product and possible follow-up products. According to Danovich, Williams looked him right in the face and said, quote, "You have to send it out," unquote. Because of factoring, TSR had already received money from an investment bank for the sale of those CD-ROMs. If TSR did not send the product out, they would be breaching that prior agreement. Now, TSR could have attempted to pay the bank back for the money the company had already received, but one of the themes of the 1990s at TSR was there was no money available for anything like that. The units were shipped to Babbages. Danovich said, quote, "They immediately hit the market at liquidation prices. Every single one of them. It literally killed that marketplace for that product and subsequent products in that line because we had zero credibility in the book and hobby trade at that point. We'd sold a dud product out into a product category that we were trying to break into." Jim Falone remarked dryly that TSR's expenses were, quote, "not recouped," unquote, on the CD-ROM rule set. Meanwhile, let me check my stream. Okay, looks like we're okay. Meanwhile, TSR wasn't paying its printer the fine people of J.B. Kinahan Printing in Beaver Dam, Wisconsin. TSR let its bill with Kinahan get so delinquent that the company had to give to Kinahan TSR's office building in Lake Geneva. Lorraine Williams had a meeting with the entire staff of TSR and presented giving Kinahan the TSR building as some sort of win for the company. More ominously, TSR also signed an exclusivity agreement with Kinahan. In other words, TSR agreed not to print games or books with anyone other than Kinahan. TSR also attempted to start a comic book company in Los Angeles in the early 1990s. This is where we come to Flint Dilli, one of the most colorful characters that I've interviewed for this book. He is the co-heir to the Buck Rogers fortune. He's Lorraine Williams' brother. He is also the scriptwriter of American Tail 2, Fievel Goes West. When I interviewed him, he pointed out that he is one of the only people ever hired by both Steven Spielberg and George Lucas to work on writing projects, which is true. Steven Spielberg and George Lucas both hired him to write for them, which is a hell of a thing to think. I mean, you can put that on your tombstone. So he wanted Dungeons & Dragons back on TV and decided that the best way to develop that intellectual property would be through a comic book company. But those of you familiar with your D&D history may realize that there's a catch here, which is that TSR is already publishing D&D comic books over at DC. And DC is publishing an advanced Dungeons & Dragons line and a Forgotten Realms comic. And the comics are doing well. Sales were hitting about the 100,000 mark at that time. That was like Wonder Woman level sales for the late 80s and early 90s. So it was doing totally fine at DC. Now, TSR is going to start a comic book company and end up going into competition with their own licensee. Jeff Grubb, who wrote the Forgotten Realms comic for DC, tells me that this was all about Buck Rogers. Williams wanted a Buck Rogers comic made by DC, and DC wouldn't do it, so TSR decided to do it themselves, even though they knew this was going to anger DC Comics, because they're going into competition with their own licensee. Now, Flint Dilli and the people who actually worked at TSR West do tell a different story. They say that Brad Munson, who had a lot of experience in publishing, and Stephen Grant, who really made the Punisher into the vigilante we all know and love today, wanted to start a comic book company. They hooked up with Flint Dilli, who brought in Lorraine Williams, who took out a loan to finance this comic book company. Now, I want to focus on the loan for a second there. Brad Munson and Stephen Grant were both like, oh yeah, Lorraine Williams took out a loan to finance TSR West. When I asked Flint Dilli, so did your sister pay for TSR West with a loan? Flint Dilli said to me words that I will remember for the rest of my life. He said, money was invisible to me. Yeah. So, because TSR could be construed as going into competition with their licensee DC Comics, they decided that they couldn't actually start a comic book company, even though it was what they wanted to do. So instead of publishing comic books, they would publish comic modules. Now, a comic module is a comic book with a tiny game at the end of it, which is clearly totally different, in the same way that pepperoni pizza is not cheese pizza. The addition of the pepperoni has made it into an entirely different thing. It is not a pizza. It's not a cheese pizza. It's a pepperoni pizza. Totally different was the TSR argument. DC Comics was not fooled by the addition of the modules at the end. They realized that TSR was going into competition with them. So even though they did not find any legal recourse, DC Comics pretty abruptly canceled all of their Dungeons and Dragons comic book lines when TSR West started to become a thing. TSR West also looked to Random House for distribution into Barnes & Nobles and B. Daltons. Which, again, sounds great on paper because they have a pre-existing relationship with Random House. They know each other. Random House, again, distributes to every mall in America. The problem was when boxes of TSR material labeled comic modules arrived at B. Dalton's and Walden Books, the staff there looked at them and said, "It is a TSR product. It is a module. It has a game in the end of it." And most of them were then filed away in the gaming area. Now, gamers do not go to the game store of Walden Books to buy comic books. Comic book buyers do not go to the game section of a Walden Books to buy comics. And the comic modules were essentially lost there. Sales were absolutely terrible. You also had a lot of the games that came in the comic books, you had to cut up the comic book to play it. And TSR West received complaints from buyers being like, "Hey, we love your comic book and we actually like the game, but we don't like having to cut up our comic books." And Flint Dilli wrote a response in a comic module where he said, "We don't care. We think you should cut it up. You should reduce this to pulp. Your wife or mother should be throwing this out at some point, just totally used." I always thought, oh my God, the people that were good enough to buy his comics wrote him letters telling him what they wanted, and he said, "What you want is wrong. Don't want that." Now I want you to take a second and imagine. TSR comics were selling like Wonder Woman. Imagine a world where there were hundreds of issues of D&D comic books which could be adapted into a film today. Just imagine the impact on games and culture which D&D movies could have based on those comic books. At the time, the comic modules seemed problematic, and today the decision just seems like a blunder. While all this is going on, TSR is also driving best-selling authors out of the company. First, TSR was not paying talent what they should have been. Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman tripled their income by leaving TSR and writing for Bantam Books. Then, Lorraine Williams goes out of her way to further alienate Weis and Hickman. Margaret Weis saw Lorraine Williams at a convention. She couldn't remember what convention it was or in what year, but at a convention, Lorraine Williams comes up to her and threatens to sue her. Come on, work. Google Classroom, there we go. Okay. Weis was having a conversation with someone else when Williams approached her. Williams had a simple message to convey. She was considering suing Weis and Hickman over Rose of the Prophet. Williams believed that the pair had worked on material for the trilogy while at TSR. If so, it was company property, and under their contracts, TSR had standing to sue. She comes up and says that to Margaret Weis and never follows up on the threat. All she did was alienate someone who had made her company money with seemingly no benefit to her at all in that interaction. Aggressive negotiation on the part of TSR staff will also push another bright talent away from the company, that of Bob Salvatore. Bob Salvatore of Drizzt Do'Urden fame was driven away by TSR editor Brian Thompson. Thompson wanted Salvatore to sign a contract with TSR saying he would write 6 books for TSR. But Salvatore only wanted to sign for 3 books. Rather than simply agreeing to the 3 books that Salvatore wanted to write, Thompson threatened Salvatore. Thompson told R.A. Salvatore that if he did not agree to write 6 books, TSR would find someone else to write Drizzt Do'Urden. Salvatore said, "Okay, that is within your rights. You do own the character. But if you do that, he, Bob Salvatore, would never write Drizzt again, and the character would be dead to him." Thompson got sci-fi fantasy author Mark Anthony to write Drizzt, and Salvatore swore he would never write for TSR ever again. It is hard to measure the damage done by New York Times best-selling authors leaving the company, but when you look at the fact that ultimately TSR was not making enough money to cover its outstanding debts, and think of the millions of dollars that these people's books probably generated, it just seems like a huge mistake. Eventually, the bill for all this mismanagement came due. Random House noticed an awful lot of TSR product in their warehouse. They also noticed that TSR owed them about $10 million in refunds. Falone said that Random House, quote, began to put pressure on TSR to pay down that debt, unquote. They began to talk about garnishing a percentage of the monies paid to TSR when TSR shipped them new product. This set off alarm bells in the executive suites at TSR. TSR, Falone said, quote, was built on a business model like the old Hollywood movie studios. There was a lot of overhead for a game company with writers, designers, and artists all on the payroll full-time with health benefits, unlike much of our competition. This put TSR in a position where there was not a lot of room for big cash flow fluctuations, unquote. Furthermore, Falone said that because of the money TSR was spending on innovation products like the AD&D Core Rules and video production for Dragon Strike, quote, our overhead had increased to a point where there was no room to lower our cash flow, unquote. In other words, TSR could not have Random House decrease their payment for shipped products to TSR. Something needed to be done about the debt to Random House, and fast. So the creatives were ordered to create a pitch to Random House for a joint young adult book series and game line. Falone described it as a mashup of Percy Jackson and the Teen Titans if the Teen Titans were international Olympic athletes, unquote. He added, the concept had a strong tie to the Olympics, so he could take advantage of the promotional media frenzy leading to the summer of 1996, unquote. Falone said this would give TSR breathing room because the money from the creative work would then be applied to TSR's debt. In 1995, TSR executives, including Jim Falone and Lorraine Williams, met with Random House Executive Vice President Jerry Harrison in a room at the O'Hare Hilton. For TSR, it was a high-stakes meeting with the future of the company on the line. Falone recalled that Williams pressured the Random House executives for a financial commitment to the project a mere 15 minutes into the meeting. Harrison said he could not promise TSR any money without running it by Random House president Alberto Vitali. When this became clear, Falone recalled, quote, Lorraine Williams said, I guess we're done, and got up and we all walked out, end quote. The fact that Random House was not willing to make a deal without authorization from the very top, and that TSR owner Lorraine Williams was desperate for cash flow, indicated to Falone that, quote, things were much more serious than we thought. Rather than go back to what was sure to be a tense executive wing in Lake Geneva, we went to a bar for the rest of the day, unquote. TSR decided to attempt to make Random House jealous. Falone said that the relations with Random House were strained after the meeting. So TSR began to flirt with other distribution partners, hoping that Random House might forgive some of the debt in order to keep TSR as a customer. Falone said TSR started talking to Tor Books and Macmillan to make Random House jealous, but also to see if Macmillan would buy us out of our Random House deal and our debt, unquote. To drive home to Random House that TSR was on the prowl for a new distributor, a dramatic plan was hatched. In the spring and fall of every year, Random House held a sales conference with all their publishers. TSR, of course, attended every one. And at a sales conference after the O'Hare Hilton incident, TSR was scheduled to deliver a presentation. And just so everyone knows, I would speculate I'll be done in 2 minutes. In an attempt to improve their position in renegotiations with Random House, TSR ditched the Random House sales conference, and Falone said, quote, we instead flew to Florida for the Macmillan sales conference, end quote. TSR only called Random House to tell their creditor and distributor they wouldn't be attending the sales conference an hour before they were due to present to their sales force. And Falone said the intention of the maneuver was that in order to keep us, Random House would forgive some of the debt. Random House, however, was utterly unmoved. After all the bother and drama, TSR didn't manage to sign with Macmillan either. To those who knew the whole story, TSR was clearly an ailing company. However, knowledge of the true state of things in Lake Geneva was kept from most employees, and certainly from employees from gamers at large. In the fall of 1996, there were massive returns from Random House. TSR now owed Random House millions of dollars that it did not have. This provoked layoffs the Friday before Christmas in 1996. Dozens of people were let go from TSR in an effort to lower costs. And in the new year, Kinahan, the printer, refused to print any more TSR books. TSR was now screwed in both directions. Their distributor, who puts its products in front of fans, was demanding money. And its printer, the company that produces the physical products for TSR to sell, was demanding money and refusing to print anything else. TSR was, at that moment, a publishing company that could not publish. But products were still being completed at TSR. They just were not being published. There was a room that completed projects were put in. It was a room full of Ziploc bags and floppy disks. And TSR employees would continue marching past the room, looking at these products that were not going out, not being produced, not being sold, and not bringing money into the company. Dale Donovan remembers that room. He said, quote, "I saw the room. I saw those bags." He said the sight of them was depressing, end quote. And the number of bags in that room simply kept growing and growing and growing. In the spring of 1997, TSR was purchased by Wizards of the Coast, saving Dungeons & Dragons, but marking the end of TSR. The negotiation of that deal is the subject of my next seminar. So if you are interested, hopefully YouTube Live continues to hold up for us. Hopefully it doesn't drop out. But if you're interested, again, I can have as many people on YouTube Live as want to be there. So if you didn't know about that seminar and you want to come, you should be able to find it on the Gen Con website. I would love to take questions, but this went long. If you have any questions, you can ask me on the Gen Con page. On Twitter, I'm at BenRiggs_. You can email me at riggsbl@gmail.com, and I believe that this video will now be living on YouTube, so you can share it with friends if you're interested. Thank you all so very, very much. I have to run to set up the next seminar, though, so hopefully I'll see some of you very briefly. Thank you all for coming. Peter, thank you for putting this together, and thank you for saving Dungeons & Dragons, as long as we're talking about that. And everybody, have a great day, but I have to run. Bye-bye!